Welcome to the Crime Off Shidio, where we unearth the stories history tried desperately to bury, the ones clawing beneath the surface in the shadows of forgotten houses and silenced families. It was a rain-soaked evening in November of 1957 when the last living member of the Greaves family, Alina, passed away quietly in the grand decaying mansion that had long dominated the skyline of a small New England town called Ashbourne. What no one knew at the time was that the attic of the Greaves estate had remained locked for over 60 years, sealed by hinges rusted beneath decades of neglect, hiding secrets so unsettling that the town itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief that the door had gone unopened for so long. But the truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined, and what lay behind that attic door changed everything. The year was 1897 when Ambrose Greaves, the patriarch of one of Ashbourne's oldest families, commissioned a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. It was nestled beneath the twisted limbs of ancient oaks that stretched out like gnarled fingers over the winding dirt road leading to the estate. The house itself was an imposing structure, its steep gabled roofs looming sharply against the steel-gray sky, black shingles worn by countless storms, punctuated by multiple chimneys that puffed smoke lazily over its weathered moss-covered walls. Inside, vast portraits of stern-faced ancestors hung in faded gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow visitors as though guarding the many whispered secrets within. It was the kind of place that inspired awe and unease in equal measure, a place where respectability clashed with an undercurrent of unease no one ever spoke of aloud. I first became drawn to the Greaves estate several years ago, when I inherited a partial estate from a distant relative I barely knew existed. A rather grand but fading leather-bound journal belonging to Ambrose himself. My name is Thomas Drake, a historian with a penchant for lost stories and forgotten lineages, and the journal seemed an invitation to an unknown chapter in this eerie house's long-shadowed saga. When I first arrived in Ashbourne, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The town's narrow cobblestone streets, slick with rain and carpeted in a mist that clung low to the ground like a shroud. Local residents moved about their business with quiet eyes and guarded expressions. Their homes clustered closely, brick and clapboard painted in fading shades of white and gray. Ashbourne was the kind of place where everyone had heard something about the Greaves family, but refused to say it outright, a sort of silent agreement that the past was better left undisturbed. The mansion sat atop a slight hill, its sprawling grounds choked with unruly hedges and wildflowers long since turned to overgrowth. The iron gates creaked like aged bones as I pushed them open, the chain wrapped around them coated in rust and echoes of forgotten voices. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust mixed with something colder. An elusive scent I could not place, but that seemed to wrap around me like a chill. Floorboards groaned beneath my footsteps as I ventured from room to room, each seeming frozen in time. Furniture covered in yellowed sheets thick with dust, wallpaper peeling and curling strips like dying skin. Portraits of solemn faces lined the staircase walls, and portraits seemed to watch me with quiet accusation, or perhaps warning. But it was on the third floor that I noticed the heavy oak door set flush against the right wall of the narrow hallway. A door that bore a stamped iron lock, old and heavily corroded. But for reasons unknown, it had never been opened for well over half a century. The locals told me that it had been locked by Ambrose himself in the early 1900s and had remained so ever since, a curious fact that only deepened the house's mystery. No one knew who had the key. No one dared even to ask. There was an old rumor about the attic room, a place where the air remained still and thick, where no breeze entered, even when the rest of the house breathed freely. But those were just the whispered stories of children frightened by shadows. Yet something about that locked attic began to draw me in relentlessly. There was a haunting melody. I thought I glimpsed in the back of my mind a chorus of unspoken words and silent cries tangled in the wood grain and settling dust. The first seed of wrongness was planted when I found the old keepsake box behind one of the portraits in the parlor. Inside, beneath wrinkled black lace and brittle yellow papers, was a brittle folded letter addressed to Ambrose from a physician, a Dr. Jeremiah Halstead, mentioning an experiment, a quarantine, and 15 children entrusted to the care of the estate 5 decades prior. The language was clinical but tinged with dread, speaking of confinement and observation in a clandestine manner, as if describing forbidden research that was never meant for the public eye. My curiosity only grew, and the journal pages offered faint traces of shriveled sorrow. Entries spoke of restless nights and voices carried on the draft. But these were only half-journals, fragmented thoughts before entries abruptly ended one December evening in 1911. What they found behind that door changed everything. That door announced its presence as more than just an entry. It was a barrier, a line between what should be known and what must remain buried. The clerk at the local historical society was hesitant to speak of the Greaves after learning I was there, warning too plainly not to disturb what was sealed away. The town itself seemed entangled in a pact of silence. I felt it when walking through the main street, how neighbors' gazes fell away when I mentioned the mansion, how conversation died at the edges of polite nods. But my determination was sharpened by these very things: the silence, the fear, the hidden despair that hung heavy in the twilight air. On the day I first tackled the attic door, the sky was overcast with a dull, oppressive gray cloud that muffled even the sounds of crows wheeling overhead. Rain fell in spiderweb, thin threads, drumming softly against the stained glass windows of the west side of the house. The hallway smelled of stale air and the lingering petroleum scent from decades of oil lamps. The lock was cold beneath my fingers, the metal brittle but unyielding. I found a crowbar, and with careful but steady effort pried the lock free, its rusty catch snapping with a shriek that seemed to echo down the silent hall like a scream. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an iron staircase spiraling downward into darkness, not up to an attic as expected, but down into a subterranean chamber cloaked in shadow. The air whispered of damp stone and something else, something faint but unmistakable, the unmistakable scent of old linen mixed with a faint metallic tang. I stopped, flashlight trembling in my grip as I peered inside. What lay beyond the threshold defied reason. 14 beds, narrow rusted iron-framed beds, arranged in 2 neat rows in a cavernous windowless room of roughly 50 foft by 20. Each bed was made, the thin mattresses patched and faded, but cleanly turned down as if awaiting occupancy. The room was illuminated only faintly by an old oil lamp hanging from the ceiling on a chain, its flame sputtering and casting long jittery shadows that stretched and twisted across the stone walls. There were no windows, no discernible source of fresh air, only the stale stillness of forgotten time. At the foot of each bed lay a bundle of old raggedy blankets yellowed with age, and in the far corner, a wooden chest sat half open, its contents impossible to discern in the dim light. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with jars of strange powders, glass bottles sealed with cracked wax, brittle leather, bound books stained and torn. I could hear a quiet tapping sometimes from somewhere beneath or behind the stone. The cellar's silence was punctuated by an almost imperceptible rhythmic sound like breathing. The first time I stepped inside, a cold wave swept up my spine as if the shadows themselves were watching. What had these beds been for? 14 children, one fewer than the doctor's note. And why here, beneath the house in total darkness? A heavy iron door stood at the far end, barred with a lock similar to the one I had just unlatched. Its surface stained with dark smudges and long dried streaks of rust. I found a thin diary tucked beneath one of the mattresses, its pages brittle and yellowed but still legible. It contained only a handful of entries written in a trembling hand with dates from the early 1900s. The handwriting was childlike but desperate, describing the sound of voices in the walls, cold that never left, and a fear that stayed even when awake. The last entry was abruptly cut off mid-sentence, ending with the chilling phrase I will never forget, "They are coming back for us." And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, for what I discovered next is something the town still refuses to speak of. A secret bruised deep in the marrow of its history. A place where innocence was trapped and something unspeakable was left to fester in the growing shadows under the floors of a once grand family estate. The attic was not just a locked room in a fading mansion. It was a tomb, the locus of a forgotten horror sealed away for 60 long years, until now. The question remains, what became of those children? And why did their beds remain empty for so long, without a single window to the outside world? I was about to find out, though what awaited me defied every law of reason and mercy. No one in Ashbourne ever spoke of it again until now. The air hung heavy as I descended the narrow iron staircase. Each creak and whisper of the metal groaning beneath my feet, a reluctant confession to the secrets the house had painstakingly kept. There, in that subterranean chamber, the walls pressed in silently, their damp stone surfaces absorbing every sound, every breath. I was drawn deeper, illuminated only by the flickering glow of the oil lamp overhead, which cast more shadow than light, giving life to sinister shapes at the periphery of my vision. My fingers trailed over the cold iron bed frames lined in perfect rows. 14, just as the physician's letter predicted. But why had one been omitted from the note? And why were these beds aligned meticulously, as if waiting for their occupants to return? I found myself shivering not from the chill, but a primal dread that something beyond explanation eyed me from those pitch, dark corners. I knew I could not face the mystery alone. Back in town, I sought out those who still remembered. Old Mrs. Abernathy, a frail woman nearing her 90th winter, had lived her entire life in Ashbourne and was rumored to have worked in the Greaves household as a maid in the 1920s. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp still, reflected a haunted past as she recounted. They never spoke of those children openly. Folks knew they were there, locked away beneath that grand house. But what they endured was a story whispered only between trembling lips. There was fear, always fear. I told her about the beds, the diaries I found beneath the mattress. She clutched my sleeve and warned, "You best not chase ghosts that don't want to be found." But the knot of curiosity had already tightened within me. Her memory faltered on the names, but she described nightly cries, soft at first, growing louder when the wind howled. It was as if the house exhaled the sorrow of those lost souls. Days later, I stumbled upon another testament hidden within a bundle of correspondence tied with faded ribbon in a local estate archive. A collection of letters between Ambrose Greaves and the doctor, Halstead. These missives unveiled a troubling experiment under the guise of care. Halstead writes in one letter that these children were believed to be carriers of a rare disease, an illness shrouded in miasma and superstition, and thus were consigned to isolation for observation. Ambrose insists on discretion, fearing the scandal could ruin the family name. But deeper in the text lies a phrase chilling in its cold clinicality. Prolonged confinement is necessary to prevent contagion of spirit as well as body. a cryptic line hinting at something far more than physical illness. I recalled the diary's last entries. The child's trembling hand desperate in ink traces, describing shadows that crept beyond the edges of sleep, voices murmuring through the stone, and the pervasive cold that visited even the warmth of daylight hours. Whoever this child was, their fear was palpable and contagious. It became clear that the attic was not simply a room, but a chamber designed intentionally as a prison, a receptacle for suffering shielded from the world above. Seeking further clarity, I made my way to the Ashbourne Town Hall, where the custodian of records was a reticent man named Mr. Hanley. His face, lined with the weary resignation of decades, spent sifting through the town's forgotten annals. Darkened upon hearing mention of the Greaves attic, we sat in a narrow, dim-lit office, where the scent of aged parchment and furniture polish clung stubbornly to the air. He hesitated then, recounted an obscure police report from 1915 documenting an unusual disappearance case involving the Greaves estate. The report noted the sudden vanishing of 3 local children who had been last seen near the mansion. No bodies were recovered. No suspects named. The case was quietly closed with the notation, pending further investigation, a phrase that never bore fruit. An unspoken fear seemed to contaminate that part of the record, and Mr. Hanley's warning was clear. Many threads tugged here led only to dead ends or worse, stories too dangerous to tell. The more I uncovered, the more the town's veneer of pastoral calm cracked into jagged fissures. At the local diner, murmurs drifted over cups of fading coffee and stale pie about strange lights, sometimes seen near the estate, shadows moving against the windows despite the empty rooms inside. The oldest bartender, a grizzled man named Carter, recalled his childhood fear. They said the children were taken at night by something unnatural that could pass unseen beneath the trees and through locked doors. His voice lowered to a whisper as he told me, "They say if you listen close, you can still hear their laughter or their screams, depending on the wind. But no one wants to say it outright. It's like saying it invites them back." The legend tied to the Greaves children grew like moss over the town's soul, a rot hidden beneath its quaint streets and holiday facades. One night, returning to the mansion under the brittle glow of a sickle moon, I discovered an additional door hidden behind a loose panel adjoining the attic chamber. It was smaller, narrower, its ironwork carved in cryptic patterns that defied the carving style common to the house's otherwise rigid decor. The door was unlocked, hanging ajar just enough to breathe a fetid breath of stale, oppressive air. My heart thundered as I squeezed inside, the narrow space opening into a crawl space lined with jagged stone walls slick with damp. There, scattered across the floor, lay a scatter of rag dolls threadbare with age and a diary unlike the others. This one bound in leather, cracked and brittle, its pages dense with frantic scrawl. The diary belonged to a caretaker named Marjorie Ellis, a woman employed in the early 1920s, whose account diverged from the hopeful care hinted at in Halstead's letters. She wrote first with tender regard, but soon with a growing despair that darkened every line. The children were never sick with any ordinary ailment. They were victims of an effect nobody in the town dared voice, a malady of mind and soul upon which the body was merely a vessel. Marjorie detailed rumors that the children saw things, heard voices that tore at their sanity, spoke of men in black suits who came to inspect the basement through the slit of the barred door at its far end, men who spoke of purity and sacrifice in the same breath. Her last entry was a cry for help, describing how she had begun to distrust herself, seeing shadows lurking behind her own reflection in the cracked mirrors of the house. That barred iron door, at the end of the attic chamber, suddenly took on new and terrible significance. What was locked behind it must have been the source, or perhaps the prison within the prison. The oppressive cold that I had felt upon entrance to the cellar was now rooted in a more sinister fact. This was no mere quarantine chamber, but a locus of suffering beyond even the whispers of superstition. The notion twisted into terror. I sought corroboration from other local archives and found buried references in a century-old newspaper, fragmentary and yellowed. The Ashbourne Gazette, in a faded obituary column from 1911, quietly noted the death of a child named Samuel Greaves, Ambrose's youngest son, with particulars omitted but appending the chilling phrase, "lost to the shadow sickness." A nearby editorial on mental health hinted darkly at disorders considered scandalous then, describing them as spiritual afflictions needing strict isolation. This malady, unnamed yet feared, spoke of children condemned in body and spirit, those whom the town and family chose to exile beneath stone floors and locked doors. Ambrose's promises of quiet care had been hollow at best, a veneer masking a harsh cruelty that shaped the fate of 14 beds lined with empty linens. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. The attic was never intended to keep the children safe. It was to protect the town from them, or perhaps from what they carried within. In one fragile letter dated from 1914, a local minister confided in the family's confidant regarding a confession shared in shadows with Ambrose himself. The minister described hearing cries not of human suffering, but of something primeval and unnatural, a lamentation that clawed beneath the earth and into the souls of those sensitive enough to hear. He counseled keeping the children locked away for their safety, and that of the village, implying the presence of a darkness within the family line that could not be drowned or nailed shut. The minister's words sent chills down my spine. It spoke of a curse, a poison laid upon blood, manifesting as a madness that claws and gnashes from within. As the pieces fit together, the layered horrors of the Greaves estate revealed not just a family tragedy, but a communal secret born of shame and fear. The attic was the heart of this darkness, a place where innocence was crumbled beneath cold iron frames, where the past made room only for silence, where a curse had brewed beneath the town's carefully maintained respectability. Yet one question haunted me most. If the children were so isolated, so feared, why had one bed remained unoccupied? Why had Ambrose never accounted for this empty place, as if it awaited a final soul? The diary's last warning echoed anew. "They are coming back for us." Words that twisted in the dark, hinting at a return, a reckoning still unwritten. The dawn broke cold and unforgiving over Ashbourne, mist curling low among the ancient oaks, the mansion standing silent but sentient. I realized then that the real horror was not behind locked doors or hidden beds, but in the willful blindness that had bound itself to a secret too terrible to release. And as I prepared to unlock the barred iron door at the far end of that room, a message scrawled in faded charcoal appeared on the wall, once hidden beneath the peeling plaster. "If you seek the truth, know this, some children never left." The barred iron door loomed before me like a wound in the stone, its rusted surface whispering secrets I had no wish to hear, yet could not deny. My breath formed cold clouds that lingered and faded in the still, thick air. The faint scent of mildew mingled with something far more ancient, a coppery tang, metallic and alive. I hesitated, hand resting on the latch, knowing that behind this threshold lay the darkest heart of the Greaves estate's horrid legacy. It was not simply a prison, but a crucible of fear and madness, forged by ambition and shame. Pushing against the groaning iron door felt like tearing open a grave. The hinges protested loudly before I stood within a narrow, suffocating chamber where the stone walls closed in tight, damp, and cruel. Flickering light from the oil lamp, I carried barely penetrated the blackness, revealing a single small cot against the far wall, and piled in one corner an array of aged toys, broken and warped. But it was the air that struck me most. The cold pressed deep in my lungs, bitter as a winter's breath, pressing against the ribs like a fist. A sound scraped faintly from the walls, a low, keening weeping that felt threaded with despair and something else, a terrible pleading beyond human sound. I drew closer and found a shattered mirror hanging crookedly, warped glass reflecting my trembling face back at me in fragments. In its broken shards, I caught glimpses of something else, a flicker of movement behind me, just beyond sight. The diary of Marjorie Ellis had warned of shadows and reflections, and I felt the truth of it now crawling beneath my skin. On a rickety old table, I discovered a cluster of photographs yellowed by time. 14 faces blurred with age, but unmistakably youthful. Children staring out with eyes too wide, too knowing, many showing signs of sickness, others frozen in fear. I spotted one photograph with an empty space, the missing 15th child. His place marked only by a scratch across the paper, as if erased deliberately. The room itself felt alive with unbearable sorrow. My hand brushed against a folded bundle of stained letters, tied with frayed string lying on the cot. Opening them, I read correspondences between the doctor and some shadowy figures labeled only as the board, a clandestine committee overseeing their work. Their language was surgical, yet suffused with dread. Children were more than cases, they were vessels, hosts of something the learned men could not understand or control. One letter revealed their greatest fear, a spreading affliction described as Bessel plague, an invisible infection of the soul that caused madness and unnatural transformations in the children entrusted to them. The doctor pleaded for more time, more secrecy, but the board demanded containment and eradication if necessary. Another letter bore the scars of indecision and horror, speaking of failed treatments, experimenting with poisons and isolation that pushed the children beyond the edge of human endurance. Marjorie's diary was not exaggeration, but a whispered truth from within this suffering. I sank to the cold floor, the weight of centuries pressing down. The children had not simply been quarantined, they had been condemned. That empty bed was a dread symbol. It awaited the last soul lost to this creeping darkness. Samuel Greaves, the youngest son whose name appeared scrawled on the wall behind the cot, in faded charcoal, alongside the desperate phrase, "They are coming back for us." I shivered. The phrase burned into my mind, a summons or a warning. But from where and for what? A sudden metallic clang echoed behind the heavy door, and a cold, ecstatic wind snuffed the oil lamp with a violent flicker. Darkness folded around me like a breath held for far too long. Then a voice, dry and quavering, seemed to sigh from the stones themselves. "You shouldn't be here." I stood, the hairs on my neck rising, heart hammering as I realized the room was no mere tomb, but a theater of torment, where the boundaries between the living and the restless dead blurred like wet ink. The whispered cries from the walls coalesced into a chorus, voices of children twisted by time and horror. My knees grew weak, knees that had carried me through years of research, and fear now knotted with grief and the grotesque unveiling of truth. What happened next defies any rational explanation. I noticed a faint shimmer near the far corner, just beyond the broken toys. As I edged closer, the air thickened, charged with a static cold that seemed to freeze the breath itself. There, pressed against the stone, were handprints, small fingers imprinted faintly, but unmistakably. A desperate signature left by children who had clawed at the walls for freedom, salvation, or perhaps a final embrace. The air thrummed with their presence. Then, in that frozen moment, the flicker of something alive, something neither wholly shadow nor matter, drifted across my vision like a veil. The temperature plummeted, ice crystallizing on my eyelashes, and the heavy silence shattered with a gut-wrenching scream, half sob, piercing my soul so deeply I thought my ribs would splinter beneath the weight of suffering. I was powerless to move, caught in the tragic echo of those lost children's agony. Suddenly, a memory surged through me, pulled from the old journal's rust-stained margins. A passage I had overlooked in my earlier reading. Ambrose Greaves wrote in trembling script of a visitor, a man who visited the house late at night, his presence ushering terror beneath the velvet veneer of paternal care. The entry spoke of a man in black coat and gloves, who seemed not to age, appearing at the deepest hours to collect something unseen, and to roam the underground chamber with purpose and menace. In the margins, Ambrose's handwriting slanted wildly as he cursed this visitor, calling him a specter, a harbinger of doom, whose purpose was the final cleansing of the afflicted. Who was this man? What part did he play in the children's suffering? I stumbled back to the barred door. The lock was warped and stained with what I now recognized as dried blood. My hands trembled as I slid a crowbar beneath the edge, easing it open with deliberate care. The narrow hall beyond was lined with iron bars like cages, and as the light touched the first cell, I recoiled. Inside was the skeletal remnant of a child's body, clothed in tattered, ancient fabric, the skull cracked, eyes staring into the void long after death. Nearby, another cell held remnants of clothes, stained dark, and splattered walls telling silent stories of violent death or madness unrestrained. This was the true heart of darkness, a catacomb of lost innocence and cruelty beyond comprehension. The realization burned through me. These children were not just cursed with illness or isolation, they were prisoners of inhuman acts, sanctioned by those sworn to protect them. A sudden, unnatural gust swept through the corridor, causing my lantern's flame to gutter wildly. I heard a faint shuffling and low, ragged breathing echoing from the far end of the corridor. I gripped the walls, forcing myself toward the sound despite the panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. As I rounded the corner, the corridor opened into a vast, shadowed chamber. There, in the dim glow, were rows of rusted manacles affixed to stone pillars, and staining on the floor that seemed much too fresh. The air was thick with a stale iron scent of blood long shed, but never properly cleaned. On the walls were scratched drawings, childish but grotesque, figureless shapes, winding lines resembling vines or veins, and names painfully scrawled with tiny, trembling hands. Among them, the name Eleanor Greaves appeared again. But no, this was not the matriarch who had died recently. This was a child, her name carved by desperate fingers entombed in this living hell. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. This chamber was not a mere holding place, but a site of ritual, of desperate attempts to contain a contagion that was more spiritual than physical. The family and the board had tried to hide this madness through isolation, experimentation, and cruelty masked as medical care. But the sickness had thrived on fear and despair, feeding on the children's terror, until they became something inhuman. The stories whispered by the townsfolk of men in black suits were far more than superstition. They were agents of this unholy science, wrangling what was deemed unclean, declaring which souls could live, and which must be sacrificed to the darkness beneath the earth. It dawned on me then, with the weight of centuries pressing down, that the attic beneath the Greaves estate was a crucible where innocence was burnt not in fire, but in ice frozen in time, pain, and silence. And those beds, lined in perfect rows, were not simply waiting for the children, but for their return, or more terrifyingly, for the continuation of the curse that bound this place and its inhabitants long after death. And now, as I stood at this nexus of despair and dread, I feel compelled to pause and acknowledge all of you who have journeyed this far with me through the darkness. These stories are not easy to tell, nor are they easy to hear. The journal remains unseen by most, a labor of love shared with those who seek truth in the shadows. Every view, every comment, every moment you spend listening is a gift. If you wish to support this channel beyond words, there is a Ko-Fi link in the video description and on the channel page. A simple way to buy me a coffee and keep this light burning in the murk. Even the smallest gesture makes a profound difference, allowing these dark chronicles to continue unbound by silence or neglect. Thank you for bearing witness. Now, we return to the story. Returning to the chamber, I noticed something that twisted the knife deeper into my soul. The faintest outline pressed into the stone floor like a ritual circle. Old and nearly erased, but discernible with the right light. Symbols entwined in thorny branches, arcane marks that whispered of pacts and bindings, not meant for mortal men. I realized this was no longer a story about human cruelty alone. There was something else here, older and darker. I uncovered a fragment of parchment, brittle and smeared with faded ink, hidden beneath a loose stone. It described a ceremony intended to bind the darkness that afflicted the Greaves bloodline, to cage the unruly contagion of spirit, so it would not spread beyond the estate. But the final note struck me silent. The ritual was never completed. It spoke of a final sacrifice. The missing child, the 15th bed left empty, waiting to be filled to seal the curse forever. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it the faintest whisper. A child's voice barely audible, but unmistakably there, calling out in fear and warning. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, the walls breathing as if they were lungs filled with sorrow and rage. The air was thick with despair, suffocating and absolute. The truth clawed its way through me. The attic had been a prison, not just of flesh, but of evil bound in bone and blood. The faces from the photographs flickered in my mind like candle flames dancing in a draught. Each child a victim, each bed a tomb, each shadow a bearer of secrets too rotten for the light of day. And that final warning, etched in charcoal before me, burned anew. They are coming back for us. I stumbled back, heart pounding, skin crawling as though unseen eyes watched, waiting. In that moment, the sick knowledge settled like a frostbite in my bones. The darkness was not past, not buried beneath the stone and iron, but stirring, waiting to rise again. The cruel legacy of the Greaves family was unfinished, and the attic's silence hung not in peace, but in dreadful anticipation. My flashlight flickered wildly before dying altogether, plunging me into a darkness deeper than mere absence of light. A darkness alive, hungry, and watching. I stood frozen, caught in the abyss of horror, where time dissolved into endless night. The darkness held me captive as the oil lamp's flame extinguished, swallowing the attic beneath the Greaves estate in a night thicker than any starless sky. The silence was not emptiness, but a living pulse, a subtle heartbeat beneath the stone, whispering of old torments and fractured souls. I could no longer deny what I had felt since crossing that threshold. The presence of something not merely tragic, but malignant, a darkness woven into the fiber of those walls, as old as the twisted oaks that clawed the sky outside. Trembling, I groped along the cold stone, searching blindly until my fingertips met the rusted latch again. The weight of history felt unbearable, yet I forced the door closed and ascended the iron stairs with a grinding protest. Each step a reluctant confession that some horrors were never meant to be touched by light. Daylight filtered through grimy windows on the upper floors, but none penetrated the shadows nestled below. I emerged from the subterranean prison haunted, not only by that suffocating chill, but by the story no living soul dared speak aloud. Of children locked away, left to suffer beneath the house, their bodies lost to desecration, their spirits caught in a liminal realm neither dead nor alive. The mansion seemed to sigh with relief as I closed the attic door behind me. Yet I knew the estate's breath was but a slow, simmering threat, not an end to the terror. As I stepped outside, the cold air filled my lungs, sharp and unforgiving like judgment, and the ancient oaks swayed in the biting breeze, as if whispering secrets only the damned could understand. Yet even in the daylight, the house loomed like a beast draped in mourning shrouds, its gabled roofs and blackened chimneys casting long shadows that stretched toward the sleeping town. Ashbourne watched silently from its narrow streets, the townspeople's faces drawn tight with the weight of unspoken fear and ancestral guilt. The knowledge I held was a poison, a revelation that would forever stain the collective memory of this forgotten village. But it was more than that. It was a reckoning. The final truth blossomed like a poisonous flower, its petals composed of silence, shame, and a darkness that no amount of time nor distance could erase. In sifting through records and testimonies, I had pieced together a grim tableau. Ambrose Greaves was not merely a patriarch trying to shield his family from scandal. He was the architect of a living nightmare, a man desperate to cage an evil, inscribed deep within his bloodline. The children in the attic were victims of a madness that transcended physical illness, a spiritual contagion, a blight on the soul that could neither be cleansed nor understood by the science of the era. The experiment was no mere quarantine. It was a purge conducted in secrecy, a slow annihilation disguised as care. The 13 beds that were occupied had housed children who perished one by one in that stony tomb of silence, their bodies discarded like detritus, yet their spirits caught in a waking death, trapped eternally between worlds. The 14th bed, as it turned out, was never empty. It remained untouched not because it awaited an innocent soul, but because it held the locus of the curse itself, the vessel containing the irremediable darkness tainting the Greaves lineage. Samuel, the missing child erased from memory, yet seared into the house's very foundations. When I confronted the reality of that empty bed, the house seemed to breathe in unison with my dread. The curse was not some abstract evil, but a tangible, ineffable presence waiting to reclaim what was promised to it. The whispered phrase carved in charcoal, "They are coming back for us," revealed itself as a warning, a prayer, or perhaps a summons never meant to be ignored. The people of Ashbourne knew this truth in their bones. Their silence was no accident, no cowardice merely. It was a pact, a fragile barrier maintained by fear and superstition, a collective denial of an ancient evil lurking beneath their feet. I understood, then, that the mansion was both tomb and threshold, and that by unsealing its doors, I had torn a delicate membrane between the known and the unknowable. There was no escaping the consequences that followed. The estate's grim history spilled into the present like a slow poison. That very night, after I returned to a modest inn on the edge of town, a cold wind penetrated the thick walls, bearing with it distant laughter, and the faintest trace of children's voices, soft, mournful, and unsettlingly clear. I closed the windows and bolted the heavy door, but the sound lingered in the shadows beyond the flickering candlelight. I was not alone. The town's old stories now felt like desperate attempts to prepare unwelcome visitors. Spirits of the cursed children whose torment was eternal, and whose fate was bound inexorably to the place where they had been condemned. Sleep, whenever it came, was thin and fractured by dreams that blurred between waking and nightmare. Faces appeared in those dreams, ragged, ghostly children reaching with murmuring hands, beckoning me back to the attic's cruel embrace. What had once been a pursuit of history now turned darkly personal. An entanglement with a legacy not purely human nor fully spectral. In attempting to expose the truth, I had become part of the story, an unwilling keeper of sorrow and dread. Yet even as the sun rose pale and weak to illuminate the town, a black sentinel awaiting the return of what was promised. The Greaves estate has not been sold. It has not been renovated. It stands decaying and uninhabited, a relic too dangerous for the modern world. Its windows like blind eyes staring into emptiness. Locals avoid its grounds after dusk, and whispers tell of strange figures glimpsed drifting beyond the broken fences. Shadowy children lost to time, forever circling their prison. And though the house sleeps, the curse endures, an indelible stain on Ashbourne's soul. The children, it seems, never truly left. They linger in the silence, in the cold drafts that snake through the empty halls, in the flicker of a candle sputtering out, in the creak of floorboards that should long have rotted away. I found myself compelled to ask not what the darkness was, but why it persists. Perhaps because evil born of human cruelty never dies purely. It festers, it mutates, and it waits, bound to place in blood. The beds remain silent witnesses to a horror resigned to repetition. Because some stories are not buried, they are mirrored, endlessly reflected in those who dare to look, in the houses we inherit, in the shadows we carry within ourselves. The final reckoning is not a conclusion, but an awakening, a revelation that the past claws back, unbidden, into our present lives. There is a line between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. But in places such as the Greaves estate, this line blurs and folds, and what waits in the spaces between is neither justice nor mercy, but a cold, eternal void. Years later, when the records were finally unsealed, and the town reluctantly acknowledged the atrocity, attempts were made to document and memorialize the children lost to that windowless prison beneath the mansion. Yet the efforts felt hollow, as if the weight of their suffering warped the very memory of them. Memorial plaques, quiet ceremonies, none could reach the depths of silence or undo the betrayal endured. The moral fracture remains, a scar sewn into the fabric of Ashbourne's history, ever reminding us that sometimes the greatest horrors are not fresh wounds, but old ones left to fester in darkness. I have returned to the Greaves estate since those first dreadful nights, but I enter with great caution. The oppressive atmosphere thickened by the passage of time, and the restless whispers that linger like smoke through the halls. Some nights, standing in the parlor beneath the peeling wallpaper and cracked portraits, I hear the faint echo of children's laughter. Or is it crying? The mansion breathes around me, a sentient relic bound to the tragic cadence of forgotten souls. In these moments, I confront the terrible conclusion. The attic was never merely locked for 60 years out of neglect or prudence. It was sealed because what resided inside could not be allowed freedom for the living, for the town, and perhaps for the world itself. The 14 beds without windows were not merely furniture, but symbols, a testament to innocence lost, and a warning of what lies behind the facades we maintain. And that final, unoccupied bed, waiting still, speaks to a darkness that is patient, eternal in coming back. It waits for the reckoning that will never be complete until the last breath is uttered, the last secret whispered, and the final bed is filled. So, as I bid farewell tonight, I invite you to consider this. What locks you in your own attic of memory? What curses lurk beneath the floorboards of family, history, or place? The Greaves estate is a monument not just to horror, but to the lengths we go to bury the unspeakable. And yet some doors, no matter how carefully sealed, begin to creak open from the inside. If this story unsettles you, if it chills you in a way that lingers beyond the screen, I ask kindly that you like and subscribe to the Crime Off Shidio. It is only through your support and shared curiosity that these forgotten shadows can continue to be unearthed.